Which brings me to the last, and in my opinion, most dangerous set of adversaries of the evidence-based worldview in the contemporary world. Namely, propagandists, public relations flacks, and spin doctors, along with the politicians and corporations who employ them. In short, all those whose goal is not to analyze honestly the evidence for and against a particular policy, but is simply to manipulate the public into reaching a predetermined conclusion by whatever technique will work, however dishonest or fraudulent. So the issue here is no longer mere muddled thinking or sloppy reasoning, it's fraud. Now, when I gave this talk in London last year, I had to be careful, because as you probably know, the English libel laws are rather stringent. I don't know whether that's also the case in Sweden. So just to avoid any misunderstanding about whether I'm accusing George Bush and Tony Blair of fraud, let me be clear, I am. I'm relying on the fact that even in England, and I hope also in Sweden, truth is an absolute defense against a charge of libel. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines fraud as, quote, the using of false representations to obtain an unjust advantage or to injure the rights or interests of another. And in the Anglo-American common law, a false representation can take many forms, including, and here I'm quoting from legal handbooks. First, a false statement of fact known to be false at the time it was made. A statement of fact with no reasonable basis to make that statement. A promise of future performance made with an intent at the time the promise was made not to perform as promised. An expression of opinion that is false made by one claiming or implying to have special knowledge of the subject matter of the opinion, where special knowledge means knowledge or information superior to that possessed by the other party and to which the other party did not have access. Anything here sound familiar? These are the standards that we would use if George Bush and Tony Blair had sold us a used car. In fact, they sold us a war that has thus far cost the lives of 179 British soldiers, 4,295 American soldiers, and somewhere between 80,000 and 1 million Iraqis. And I'm really sad to say that I cannot quantify more accurately than that the number of dead Iraqis. The American and British dead have been counted down to the one, and I can't tell you the number of dead Iraqis even within a factor of 3. That's shocking but true. In any case, it's a human toll of somewhere between 25 and 300 September 11th. It's a war that has thus far cost the American taxpayers a staggering $669 billion, with ultimate estimates ranging from $1 to $3 trillion. Now, I used to think that that was a staggering sum. I'm not so sure anymore. A war that has strengthened both Al-Qaeda and Iran. In short, a war that may well turn out to be the greatest foreign policy blunder of American history. Now, of course, the British have a longer history, and hence a longer history of blunders to compete with. Now, all this is very likely old hat to most of the people in this room. We know perfectly well that our politicians, or at least some of them, lie to us. We take it for granted, we're inured to it, and that may be precisely the problem. Perhaps we've become so inured to political lies, so hard-headedly cynical, that we've lost our ability to become appropriately outraged. We've lost our ability to call a spade, a lie, a fraud. Instead, we call it spin. Now, we've traveled a long way now from science, if you understand it narrowly as physics, chemistry, biology, and the like. But the whole point is that any such narrow definition of science is misguided. We live in a single real world. The administrative divisions used for convenience in our universities do not, in fact, correspond to any natural philosophical boundaries. It makes no sense to use one set of standards of evidence in physics, chemistry, and biology, and then suddenly relax your standards when it comes to medicine, religion, or politics. Lest this sound to you like a scientist's imperialism, I want to stress that it's exactly the contrary. As the philosopher Susan Hack lucidly observes, quote, our standards of what constitutes good, honest, thorough inquiry and what constitutes good, strong, supportive evidence are not internal to science. In judging where science has succeeded and where it has failed, in what areas and at what times it has done better and in what worse, we're appealing to the standards by which we judge the solidity of empirical beliefs or the rigor and thoroughness of empirical inquiry generally. The bottom line is that science is not merely a bag of clever tricks that turn out to be useful in investigating some arcane questions about the inanimate and biological worlds. Rather, the natural sciences are nothing more or less than one particular application, albeit an unusually successful one, of a more general rationalist worldview, centered on the modest insistence that empirical claims must be substantiated by empirical evidence. Conversely, the philosophical lessons learned from 4 centuries of work in the natural sciences can be of real value if properly understood in other domains of human life. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that historians or policymakers should use exactly the same methods as physicists. That would be absurd. But neither do biologists use precisely the same methods as physicists. Nor, for that matter, do biochemists use the same methods as ecologists, or solid-state physicists as elementary particle physicists. The detailed methods of inquiry must, of course, be adapted to the subject matter at hand. What remains unchanged in all areas of life, however, is the underlying philosophy, namely, to constrain our theories as strongly as possible by empirical evidence, and to modify or reject those theories that fail to conform to the evidence. That's what I mean by the scientific worldview. It's because of this general philosophical lesson, far more than any specific discoveries, that the natural sciences have had such a profound effect on human culture since the time of Galileo and Francis Bacon. The affirmative side of science, consisting of its well-verified claims about the physical and biological world, may be what first springs to mind when people think about science. But it's the critical and skeptical side of science that is the most profound and the most intellectually subversive. The scientific worldview inevitably comes into conflict with all non-scientific modes of thought that make purportedly factual claims about the world. And how could it be otherwise? After all, scientists are constantly subjecting their colleagues, and I should add their own, theories to severe conceptual and empirical scrutiny. On what grounds could one reject phlogistic chemistry, or the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or Newton's particle theory of light, or take any number of now abandoned scientific theories, and yet accept astrology, homeopathy, or the virgin birth? In fact, the critical thrust of science even extends beyond the factual realm to ethics and politics. Now, of course, as a logical matter, one cannot derive an ought from an is. So in that sense, ethics and factual matters are logically separate. But historically, starting in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, and then spreading gradually to more or less the entire world, scientific skepticism has played the role of an intellectual acid, slowly dissolving the irrational beliefs that legitimated the established social order and its supposed authorities, be they the priesthood, the monarchy, the aristocracy, or allegedly superior races and social classes. 400 years later, it seems sadly evident, as I've tried to demonstrate this evening, that this revolutionary transition from a dogmatic to an evidence-based worldview is very far from being complete. So I'd like to thank you all for your patience in sitting through this long diatribe and open the floor to all the comments and criticisms that you'd care to throw at me. Thank you.